This movie began as an experiment to see if somebody, that somebody being me, with very modest woodworking skills but basic facility with tools, could make a truly nice double knitting board. And I did. That means you can too. I will show you exactly what I did, and you can do it too. I used all readily available hand tools and easily purchased supplies, starting with these 1x1 by 12-inch maple wood blocks. These pieces of wood are a little bit thicker than are typically used for double knitting boards, but I wanted to be sure that the board would not flex inward in use. I've seen that happen, and it messes with your gauge. Although they arrived in nice, smooth condition, I did spend a good bit of time sanding them and then using fine steel wool on them to get them really silky smooth. In the past, I have found that it really matters, perfect smoothness, because not only do your hands appreciate it while you're knitting, but the fiber, whatever yarn you're using, will find every little uneven spot and snag on it. And I will never have as good of access to sand and smooth as I do now before the loom is assembled. This is the sandpaper that I'm using, and I finished the process with very fine steel wool. For the pegs, I used Cotter pins, which are my favorite double knitting type of peg. You could make a loom like this bigger or smaller, but if you start as I did with a 1-foot board and use the whole thing, you will need 52 pegs, and that means 52 Cotter pins. I bought the pin assortment that you see and used the 3/32 by 1.5 inch size. You'll also need nuts and bolts, and we need pretty slender, long ones. I used 6-32. Either wing nuts or regular nuts will work. Wing nuts are very convenient. The reason the bolts must be slender is I'm using 2 holes rather than 1 to allow us to either align the pins perfectly or offset them for certain stitches such as fisherman's rib. I chose to make both the spacing between the pegs and the spacing from the edge of the board to the pegs 1 centimeter. I will explain my thinking on that. This is a peg spacing that I like to knit with. It's comfortable for wrapping and produces very nice fabric. I am American and we normally use inches, but 1 centimeter is about 25/64 of an inch. It's no fun to try to measure 25/64 across a foot of board down the ruler, whereas the centimeter edge is nice and clear with big numbers and big marks. Traditionally, people make knitting boards with the pegs closer to the edge. I was concerned that with my basic tools and basic skills, I might splinter the edge of the board, and I've had perfectly good experiences knitting with pegs a little bit withdrawn from the edge, so I decided to do that. I'm using the boards, except for sanding, just as they came, and they're not identical in length. I just elected not to worry about that, but I will make every effort to make the pegs align perfectly from board to board. My first peg is positioned 2.5 centimeters from the end of the shorter board. Then I marked both boards across their width with 25 additional positions for pegs at 1 centimeter intervals, being as precise as it is possible to be with a pencil and a ruler. I'm using a plain old twist drill, and I want all of my holes to be drilled to the same depth. So here's a do-it-yourself measuring device. Having drilled the first hole to a suitable depth, I'm leaving the drill stuck in the wood and wrapping painter's tape around it to note the amount of the bit that's still exposed, so that the next time I drill a hole, I will see the painter's tape approaching the wood and know to stop. To help drill accurately, I made a finishing nail divot in each position that will hold a peg. Of course, make every effort to keep your drill perfectly vertical and begin every hole exactly on the marked position. My first try, I broke off a drill bit by trying to drill the entire hole in one step, Thereafter, I learned to make only 6 or 8 twists, then remove the drill, clean it, and go back for a deeper plunge. For the first few holes, I would drill and then rotate the handle backwards, as you see me doing. I later discovered I can keep drilling forwards as long as I lift up on the drill, and that gives me less risk of accidentally loosening the bit. I did find it absolutely essential to clamp the board that I'm working on to the table. I made each hole 3/4 of an inch deep using a 5/64 inch bit. Manually drilling this many holes is rather tiring for my hands, so I alternated drilling and inserting the pegs. In a long ago loom knitting group, I remember a discussion of using Cotter pins for pegs, and one of the people said they knit a lot more comfortably if you first flex them open, then pinch them back together to insert them in the holes. This also helps them to stay in the holes without any glue. The thinking is that you may knit by running your loom tool down the groove, and it'll fit more comfortably if that groove has been flexed a little. I don't honestly know if I agree, because I don't know if the looms that I have using Cotter pins were made by pre-flexing them or not, but I got pretty good at doing so using a steak knife. We have this set that we use for all sorts of utility purposes, not for food. Cotter pins have been used for quite a long time to create looms, and some people prefer them in one orientation and some the other. I like them as you see, with the round side towards me and the side with the slot in it facing the length of the loom. Here I'm getting the feel of how to hold the pin as straight as possible and hammer it in. Later I get much faster at it. Creating more starter divots with my finishing nail here, and then inserting more pegs. I never really got this fast, of course, but it did become more efficient as I went along. And it wasn't actually difficult to learn to keep the pegs even. On each board, once all the pegs were in, I sighted across it using a ruler, and I can see any pegs that are sticking up, keeping the remainder from touching the ruler, so I can correct them. In order to join the two boards together, to get them in the double knitting position, there needs to be at least one hole through each board where the dotted line is. On the right hand end of this one is the bolt head. The bolt is in the middle, running through the centers of the spacers that are separating the two boards. Usually I use a stack of washers. In this case, I happen to have 2 nylon nuts that added up to the correct spacing, so I'm using those. And on the other end of the bolt, it is fastened with either a regular nut or a wing nut. This time I used both. The reason for using both is because using 3-inch bolts will allow me to separate the boards wider for bulkier yarn. This is number 4 yarn. I can also use number 5. If I do, I'll need more space, so I need the extra length on the bolt. However, while using number 4 yarn, I don't want the bolt end sticking out because it can snag the knitting accidentally. Therefore, I use enough nuts to just bring it out and cover the end of the bolt, and that helps. So in the space at the ends of the boards where there are not any pegs, with the boards clamped together, we need to drill through both of them and make at least one set of holes. But I want to be able to offset my boards, so I wanted 2 sets of holes. This means those 2 holes will only be a 1/2 centimeter apart. That's why we had to use skinny bolts. You may use bigger bolts if you want to, if you only want a single set of holes. Just as for drilling all the other holes, I needed to back the drill out, clean the threads, and clean the hole repeatedly to get all the way through. The hole should be drilled halfway up the height of the board. Mark the position for the first hole 1 centimeter from the end, the position for the second hole 1.5 centimeters from the end. Those will mark the center points of the holes. The holes may be positioned by holding a ruler up to the line where all 4 holes should fall and making 4 pencil marks. It is important that everything aligns. In other words, the line be straight across, and the second set of holes centered 1/2 centimeter from the first set of holes. Now let's get those clamps off and have a look. I had to clean the backs of my holes up a little bit, and you might too. But after I did that, everything fitted together nicely. This wood is so hard, it may not be totally necessary, but I do find it helpful sometimes to put a washer under the nut. Here I'm aligning the boards evenly, so the pegs will be exactly across from one another. But if you use the leftmost hole on one board and the one a little farther to the right on the other board, you can skew the pegs so that they alternate across the board rather than being exactly opposed to one another. This is really useful for some stitches, such as fisherman's rib. I have 2 videos on that subject. One is basically on how to make fisherman's rib on a board set up like this, and one is on a cute little hat you can make, and there will be links to those videos in the program notes. If you're making this loom for a gift, you may possibly want to create a really nice loom hook to go with it. I love nice loom hooks, so I actually have 3 different videos on the subject, and I will place links to them in the program notes so you can make something special to go along with the loom. Here's the list of parts that I used. You could certainly make some adjustments, use more or fewer pegs to change the gauge, use bigger or smaller cotter pins at your convenience, change the nuts and bolts either length or width, but remember you have to keep skinny ones if you're going to make the loom adjustable so that the pegs will either oppose or alternate. I'm quite convinced that you could make a 24-inch rather than a 12-inch loom, and in hardwood it would still not bend. It would be stable, and I plan to try it. I've written quite a few patterns for double knitting boards, and they are all sold in my Ravelry store, not on my main website. The store also has my machine knitting patterns and single loom knitting patterns. So when you visit, just be sure you read the description. I'm always very careful to make it clear. There's a link to my store in the program notes.